Victor Pross speaking to you, Anarchy Artist. Thank you for joining me. As you can see from the title of this video, Ayn Rand, all paths to anarchism. I know that this is going to ruffle the feathers, as it were, to objectivists. And so we're going to make this a rather interesting podcast, I think. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah, we're getting some people online. Excellent. Okay, Ayn Rand's philosophy, all paths to anarchism. That is the thesis of the argument that I'm going to advance in this podcast on YouTube. So I know that this would really ruffle the feathers, as I said, to objectivists, but I think I'm going to make a very rigorous, logical argument to make the case for my thesis that Ayn Rand's approach to ethics, the entire heart and soul of her ethical approach, including her epistemology as well, her ideas in epistemology, but more directly to the point, her ethics, and even to a certain extent, the content of her views on government itself, really does lead to anarchism at the end of the day. Unwittingly for Rand, and of course, and I know that the objectivists would put up a tooth and nail fighting argument against what I would have to say to even advance a thesis of this sort. But we're going to get into it, and I'll explain very clearly, I hope, why that is the case when I say that Ayn Rand's overall philosophy does, in fact, lead to anarchism. Now, let's begin by making the point absolutely clear where Rand stands on ethics. And it's important that I do establish this much, where her stand on ethics and advancing my thesis. I'm not, and don't worry, we're not going to get into a prolonged, dissertation on Rand's ethics, though, but just some crucial nutshell within a nutshell basics have to be established here. So let's begin by quoting Rand. Stay with me. I will deliver at the end. Okay. So basically, to quote Ayn Rand here, the basic political principle of the objectivist ethics is no man may initiate the use of physical force against others. No man or group or society or government has the right to assume the role of a criminal and initiate the use of physical compulsion against any man. Men have the right to use physical force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. The ethical principle involved is simple and clear-cut. It's the difference between murder and self-defense. Now, this quote is crucial to establishing the case that I will be making. But let's just sweeten it even further by a further quote here. Man's rights can be violated only by the use of physical force. It is only the means of physical force that one man can deprive another of his life, or enslave him, or rob him, or prevent him from pursuing his own goals, or compel him to act against his own rational judgment. Okay, so basically Rand is one of the first philosophers ever to make an incredibly vigorous case against the initiation of force. I know there's a lot of people who think that the NAP also applies to retaliatory force, but they're making an error. We are talking about the initiation of force here. It's very important that you keep this in mind here, and what physical force consists of. Okay. Force has nothing to do with misgendering somebody, or the aggressive salesperson who at the candy concession stand at the movies who upsells you from a small Coke to a large Coke when you're getting your popcorn. Hey, you might want to get a large Coke there because that's a big bag of popcorn that you got there. It makes you get pretty thirsty. Or you're using force against me, no. Physical force. That's the only way that you can deprive or infringe upon somebody's rights. So, and she makes the case that the precondition of a civilized society is the barring of physical force from social relationships, thus establishing the principle that if men wish to deal with one another, they may do so only by means of reason, by discussion, persuasion, and voluntary uncoerced agreement. That's the precondition of any civilized society, is the barring of physical force from social relationships. So, as I said at the outset of this podcast, my thesis is Rand's moral principles, if consistently applied, lead necessarily to the repudiation of government. How so? Well, that's what we're going to get into right now. So, sit back, grab a beer on this hot, muggy summer day. I hope you're not multitasking, because if you're interested in anarchism and Ayn Rand, let me advance my own thesis here. Let me give you a nutshell conception of Rand's government. We established, some basics of her ethical philosophy, the non-initiation of force, which is different from retaliatory force. So it's not the rejection of force right across the board like some pacifists, but she is making the case against initiatory force, not retaliatory force. It's important for me to underline that. I don't mean to talk down or anything like that, but I just want to just make sure everything is clear here. Now, let's talk about Rand's conception of government. Put that in a nutshell. Ayn Rand's political philosophy, basically, it falls generally into the tradition of classical liberalism in one important respect. In a proper society, the government is the servant of the citizens. The servant of the citizens, not their ruler. Specifically, the government is an agent of self-defense. All right, so this is, we can see here that Ayn Rand and the objectivists are making a case for government, not on it being an initiator of force, the ruler of the citizens, but as an agency of self-defense. Okay, so that's an important distinction to make. There's a lot of so-called limited government people, conservatives, who propagate the idea that they are for limited government, but they believe in a coercive a tax system, right? They regard taxes as the guardians of civilization, the price we pay for civilization. It might not be nice, it's like you got to pay your fair share, and they're going to see that you do, but it's for the overall common good that we can have a civilized society to a greater extent. So they do believe in taxation. Others would say that, it also includes the military draft, while speaking at the other side of their mouth that they're for limited government, so, fuck the conservatives here. Rand, it really is the grandmama of all who's making a case for that thing called limited government. So, kudos to her for kudos as far as that's is concerned. Now, so basically, in short, a government's only proper function is to protect individual rights, and that's it. That's Rand's model of government. That's it. The protection of individual rights. The government itself is not to initiate force, but it's the agency of self-defense, and it deals with the issue of retaliatory force to morally justify itself. You see, so that's Rand's approach to government, which she considers to be kind of like the logical continuation of her approach with ethics. So the ethics, you can initiate force against other people, but you can retaliate. But there is a moral justification for retaliation, of course, to protect you against this imposition upon your person by physical force, of course. And the function of government is to serve as that social institution that protects the individual, for those specifically, I guess, for those people who are at least able to defend themselves, right? So that's we've established that much so far. Basically, let me hold on for 1 second here. Let's see that. Yeah, I got some people online. Well, that's good. Yeah. Okay, so that's good. I got some viewers for the live video, and that's something just to be viewed later on down the line as the months and years roll along. But let's continue. Now, For Rand, a government's essential functions are brought down to three primary functions. Three primary functions as an agency of man's or the citizenry's self-defense, to protect them against the physical force against others. So three functions: the police, to protect men from domestic criminals; the armed services, which we can assume she supports the standing army, I guess, but that's another argument. And to protect men from foreign invaders, they have the army, and then you have the law courts to settle disputes among men according to objective laws. So that's the three: the police, the law courts, and the military. 1, 2, 3, as an agency to protect individual rights, as an agency of retaliatory force, not to use its exclusive power to initiate force. So this is Rand's argument in case that she's making for the moral justification of government follows from, as she would argue, from her ethical base, from her ethical base, right? So just to really illustrate this point, okay, Rand recognizes the fact that government is force. Rand makes it clear that government is naked force, that it is basically inherently negative. The power of force is the power of destruction, not of creation. And so it must be used accordingly to destroy destruction, of course, right? To retaliate against those who would initiate force. But it's not. But that's not a positive case. It is a negative institution. Okay, so it doesn't create anything. It just protects those individuals who are trying to trade and produce and interact with one another on a voluntary basis. Right. So the retaliatory force is just to preserve that. It doesn't create anything. So it's negative in character altogether. Government is, you see. So given this, the state is only to use its monopoly on force and retaliation for the protection of individual rights, and it must never be the initiator of force. Okay? Any additional functions would have to involve the government initiating force against innocent citizens. So the state may not undertake to provide its citizens with economic standards or benefits, whether in regards to goods or services or conditions of trade or anything like that. Politicians, therefore, must have nothing to do with production or distribution, according to Rand. That is, that they cannot build, manage, or regulate schools, hospitals, utilities, roads, parks, post office, railroads, steel mills, banks, etc. Nor may it hand out subsidies, franchises, tariff protection, social insurance, so-called minimum living standards, or minimum wage laws for workers. A limited, rights-respecting government would have no welfare system, no forced pension-paying system like Social Security. It would not have agencies with open-ended and vaguely defined regulatory powers. Three functions. That's it. Dealing with the issue of retaliatory force, not itself acting in the role as some kind of producer. Okay, that's for the market. That's for the market, right? So, and you can see how that goes against, obviously, the Democrats, but we can also include there the conservatives as well, right? Because their idea of a limited government is by mouthing the words limited government while they're supporting coercive taxation, even the military draft and so forth. And of course, the conservatives, like the Democrats, are all for the welfare and minimum wage, maybe not minimum wage, but for the state interfering in this function in that area. And so basically, between the conservatives and the Democrats, it's just a haggling over how government is to initiate force. So in all of these areas, right? So Rand is truly the a defender of limited government in its actual meaning, right? Now, again, a proper government in Rand's view offers freedom from coercion, okay, including indirect force, which is fraud, and not from the responsibility of self-sustenance. Okay, so it's not to offer welfare payments or to involve itself into monetary concerns whatsoever. Okay, so just as the objectivist or Rand said, like just for the same reasons that you have separation of church and state, so you also have a separation of a government from economics, right? So there you have it. Now, to the extent a government initiates force against innocent people, it violates the very rights that it is said to protect. This is the case that Rand is making, right? Unlike blatant statists, of course, of which like I said, I include the conservatives as well. You know, however much they wish to mouth off as advocates of limited government. Bullshit. But so I do want to repeat this. You know, any additional functions would have to involve the government initiating force against innocent citizens. Okay, so government is a gun. Rand recognizes that, and she fully recognized the power of government is the power of the gun. It has the power to enforce a set of rules in the territory it controls, a power that is often turned against freedom. She recognized that, but she is making the case for government nonetheless, given what I've outlined above. So objectivism, therefore, advocates a strictly limited government in its true meaning, not the conservative bullshit, and a republican system that has only 3 specific functions to secure negative rights. Okay, that's Rand's approach to government. Just let me, make crystal clear. There must be a military, there's only 3 functions. There must be a military force for defense against external enemies. There must be a system of legislation and law courts to establish the law and to adjudicate disputes in which force might be used, but to adjudicate those disputes. And 3, there must be a system of enforcement of the law, such as the police, to make sure that the law is a social rule and not just empty words on a piece of paper. They're the muscle behind the law, of course, right? So now Rand is considered to be fully consistent on this, right? So here's another important thing, and don't forget the thesis of the video, of course, is that Rand's approach to government, her whole ethical philosophy, leads to anarchism, right? So that's what we're getting to. Okay. Now, Ayn Rand even opposed, as you can imagine, just given everything that I've said so far, opposed coercive taxation on principle, because taxation necessarily involves the initiation of force by government. And so she proposed some possible alternatives that would enable a government to finance itself by voluntary means. That's a separate subject altogether, right? Now, this is where Rand distinguishes herself even from the garden variety minarchists who go off on about how limited government they are, because they aren't talking about voluntary taxation, or in other words, voluntary contributions to the government. The conservatives aren't. So here we're getting to the pathway to anarchism. Okay, now look at, can you imagine if the defenders of either side in the ratification debate, the anti-federalists or the federalists, if they had encountered Rand's argument for voluntary taxation or voluntary contributions to the government, they would have laughed at her. They would have considered it a contradiction in terms. And even more crucial, the rejection of it would stymie. It would be the rejection of the very idea of a sovereign government altogether. This idea of voluntary contributions to the government, as Joshua Tucker put it, the consent theory of government is the universal demolisher of all governments, not the builder of any. Every defender of government has recognized coercive taxation to be an essential component of state sovereignty. So, the principle of voluntary taxation reduces RAND's government to a free market protection agency. It becomes a business on the free market that must satisfy its customer base or lose that customer base or even go out of business, right? Because remember, it's voluntary contributions to this institution. The principle of voluntary taxation reduces RAND's government to a free market agency. It's the market, it's the free market. It's all about voluntary contributions, you know. You go out to a store and you're in the market for a new computer, or shirts, a car, whatever. You're making a voluntary contribution for the product or services of that business, right? And here we have this government that's offering protection services, right? And you have to pay accordingly for those services. And in this case, RAND is making the argument that you do so voluntarily because we need this institution. We do need institutions, or an institution that would enforce contracts or settle disputes among people, because even in a fully rational society, as Rand argued, that there will be honest disagreements, not just overt criminality, of course, of people of initiating force. We need institutions to protect us against that, you know. So she is making a case for government, you know, because of that, right? But like I say, though, you know, they're legitimate services, right? But it basically reduces this whole idea of government to a free market institution. Now, even this whole thing about the night watchman, even the most minimal night watchman state funded by voluntary donations would still be coercive, though. At the very least, it would have to prohibit any competing protection services, right? So in that regard, it's going out of the market and becoming more or less, you know, what a government is all about, right? You know, I argue that it is an institution that does initiate force. That Rand's argument for, or justification for government, is flawed, right? But if we just follow the line of thought in regards to voluntary contributions for this institution, you know, then it becomes a free market business, right? But if it's to prohibit other individuals from offering the same goddamn services, if it prohibits that, now we're getting back to a proper definition of government, of course, which is an institution of initiatory force, as I would argue as an anarchist, right? So for a government to hold its monopoly, it must initiate violent force. A government, for it to be a government, must initiate force, or how else is it to retain its monopoly? Okay, even if we go with this whole idea that it's sustaining itself through voluntary contributions, but it initiates force to maintain its monopoly on those services, though, I really don't see how it really would respect you know, the citizens, that it's going to you know, look, we'll violate your rights because we're going to hold this monopoly by initiating force. But we'll respect your rights and we'll allow you to pay us, you know, by voluntary contributions. We're not going to have a coercive taxation system. You know, it's fucking ludicrous, of course, right? You know, so that's the contradiction right there. It's a contradiction right there. So this is where you have the contradiction in Rand's philosophy and her political philosophy, as judged within the framework of her overall ethical philosophy of non-aggression, you see, right? Look, let me put it this way. What is to prevent a dissatisfied customer in full possession of his individual rights from withholding his money, his voluntary contributions, while subscribing instead to the services of another agency. What is to prevent a dissatisfied customer in full possession of his individual rights from withholding his money while subscribing instead to the services of another agency offering those same services? Protection. The state is vested with the exclusive power to adjudicate legal disputes and enforce laws, while forcibly preventing other individuals and associations from engaging in the same activities. The state, in other words, as it's being revealed here, the veil is coming back, exercises a coercive monopoly in the enforcement of justice. And what you have instead, the state, therefore, is a perpetual rights violator, a massive institution of injustice, because it's, in this case, as Rand would argue, that it's to be an exclusive agency, but it's to fund itself by voluntary means, but it is to be an exclusive agency. So that's the contradiction, right? But if we follow Rand so far as her emphasis upon individual rights, or the non-aggression principle, and the non-initiation of force, looking at her ethical philosophy, and even the function that she gives to government, you can see how, voluntary contributions to the government, we can see how, well, really this is just a pathway. It's a pathway, you see, to anarchism, right? Ultimately, free market anarchists who advocate non-aggression are indebted to Ayn Rand. Now, let me make that clear, okay? Rand unwittingly is the spearhead behind the libertarian movement and the anarchist movement. They look at her overall philosophy, or ethical philosophy of non-aggression, and they can see that this institution called government violates that one way or the other. Even if you get rid of coercive taxation and you have this agency sustaining its monopoly through voluntary contributions to the government, it's still an initiator of force. And that's what the government is. It's the initiator of force. So therefore, it is not the agency of man's protection. That's not what a government is, right? But insofar as Rand is considered a classical liberal and an advocate of limited government, to the extent that she limits it to, it's a pathway, honey, baby, child, to fucking anarchism. I mean, you see the argument? Can't you see the logic here, my friends? So there you go. Now let me take a look online, see what we got here. Well, I can't read any of the comments just yet. But anyway, I've made my case. We can close it off now. Thank you for listening in. This is Victor Pross, anarchist artist. Pop goes the culture.